Margaret Whitman woke up early, as she did every day, even before the sun had fully risen. The Seattle sky was shrouded in thick clouds, and a fine drizzle cast a melancholic veil over the city. At 68 years old, Margaret had maintained a near-sacred routine since the death of her husband, Harold, 5 years ago. She ran her small cafe, Margie's Corner, with devotion and care, as if it were her anchor in a world that felt increasingly lonely. She unlocked the cafe door, letting the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and warm bread fill the air. The space was inviting, with polished wooden tables, hand-embroidered cushions, and vintage photographs adorning the walls, telling the story of decades of hard work and love for the community. It was a place that brought comfort to others, but for Margaret, it was also a constant reminder of the void Harold had left behind. As she carefully arranged the display case with croissants and muffins, her thoughts began to drift. She recalled the mornings when Harold insisted on helping her, even as his health deteriorated. Now Margaret worked alone. She chatted with loyal customers, but deep down, she knew the cafe was just a way to fill the silent days that awaited her at home. The city slowly began to wake up. The hurried footsteps on the sidewalks, mingled with the sound of cars splashing through puddles, were the prelude to another ordinary day. For Margaret, it was just another morning. What she didn't know was that her quiet life was about to be profoundly disrupted. The bell above the cafe door jingled faintly, but the sound was enough to catch Margaret's attention. She glanced over the counter and saw a small girl, thin and frail, dressed in clothes that seemed several sizes too large for her. The child hesitated in the doorway, her wide, watchful eyes scanning the room cautiously. Her tangled brown hair and pale, dirty face told a story of hardship. Margaret didn't say anything at first. She watched as the girl took tentative steps into the cafe, almost as if she were trying to blend into the shadows. The child approached the display case filled with bread and croissants and stood there, motionless, as though debating her next move. Her tiny fingers touched the glass, and for a fleeting moment, Margaret noticed something in her eyes. It wasn't just hunger. It was a quiet, desperate despair. Suddenly, the girl made a swift move. With a quick hand, she opened the glass door of the display case and grabbed a baguette. Clutching it tightly to her chest, she turned and darted toward the door. Margaret froze for a second, startled by the audacity yet unsettled by the fragility of the scene. "Hey, wait!" Margaret's voice came out louder than she intended. The girl stopped briefly at the door, turned her head, and cast a fleeting glance at the woman behind the counter. It wasn't a look of defiance but one of sheer fear. Then, without a word, she bolted into the street, vanishing into the rain. Margaret stood frozen, still clutching a dish towel in her hand. The cafe was empty at that moment, and the scene seemed to echo through the silent space. Something about that child, so small, so desperate, seared itself into her mind. It wasn't just the act of stealing. It was the expression on her face, a mixture of guilt and necessity, as if it had been her last resort. Without giving it much thought, Margaret grabbed her coat hanging near the door. She knew she couldn't just ignore this. The cold rain hit her face as she stepped outside, but Margaret didn't care. There was something about that girl that pulled at her, an unexplainable impulse. It was more than curiosity. It felt as though her heart was telling her she needed to know more. Margaret quickened her pace along the sidewalk, her old coat soaking under the relentless rain. She glanced from side to side, searching for any sign of the girl who had fled the cafe. The icy wind stung her face, but she pressed on with determination. She didn't know exactly what she would do when she found her, but something inside insisted she couldn't just let the girl vanish. Turning a corner, Margaret spotted the small figure clumsily running down a narrow street. The girl's oversized clothes flapped in the wind, and the bread she clutched seemed to be her only shield against the world. Margaret slowed her steps, careful not to draw attention. She didn't want to scare her even more. The girl darted into a narrow alleyway between two old buildings. Margaret hesitated for a moment. This wasn't the kind of place she felt comfortable in, but something greater than her fear pushed her forward. Taking a deep breath, she cautiously followed the girl. The alley was dark and foul-smelling, littered with stacks of cardboard boxes and piles of garbage bags. At the far end, under a makeshift shelter of plastic sheets and wooden scraps, Margaret saw the girl crouch down next to another child, even smaller. The boy, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, was wrapped in a filthy, tattered blanket. His eyes were half closed, as if he were either exhausted or unwell. Margaret felt a tightness in her chest as she watched the scene. The girl carefully broke the bread in half and handed the larger piece to the boy. He took it with hands trembling from the cold and began eating slowly, almost as if savoring every crumb. The girl, in turn, nibbled on what was left, her eyes fixed on him with a look of deep concern. In that moment, she seemed more like an adult in a child's body. Margaret stepped forward, and the sound of her shoes splashing in a puddle caught the girl's attention. She sprang to her feet, positioning herself protectively in front of the boy. Her eyes locked onto Margaret's with a mix of fear and defiance. It was as though she was ready to defend the little she had, even if all she had left was her dignity. "Easy," Margaret said, raising her hands in a gesture of peace. Her voice came out softer than she expected, almost like a caress in the cold air. "I'm not here to hurt you. I just want to talk." The girl didn't respond, but she also didn't run. Margaret seized the moment and crouched down to her level. "I saw what you did back at the cafe. I know you're hungry, but I don't want you to have to steal. We can figure out another way." The girl stayed silent, her eyes still wary. Margaret glanced at the boy and then back at her. "How old is he? Is he your brother?" The question seemed to disarm her for a moment, but she remained silent, gripping the boy's arm tightly. Margaret reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a package of cookies she had stashed before leaving the cafe. "Here, take this. This is for you too. No strings attached. Just something to help." She placed the package on the ground and stepped back. The girl eyed the cookies, then Margaret, before snatching them quickly with one hand, as if she still didn't fully trust her. "Thank you," the girl whispered, her voice so soft it was almost inaudible. It was the first word Margaret had heard from her, and it felt like a small victory. Margaret stood there for a few moments, observing the quiet interaction between the siblings. The girl, who couldn't have been more than 9 years old, behaved like an adult, carefully adjusting the blanket around the little boy with almost maternal care. The boy, huddled under the makeshift shelter, chewed slowly on the piece of bread his sister had given him. His distant gaze and sluggish movements worried Margaret. She took a step closer, and this time the girl didn't back away. There was something about Margaret's demeanor, perhaps the tone of her voice or the kind expression on her face, that seemed to ease the initial distrust. "Is he sick?" Margaret asked gently, nodding toward the boy. The girl hesitated before answering, as if still deciding whether she could trust Margaret. "He's been really tired. So tired." Her voice was low, almost as if she feared the weight of her own admission. "It's been days since he's had enough to eat." Margaret felt her heart tighten. The girl's gaze held a mix of despair and a strength that seemed far too great for someone so young. She crouched down again, trying to meet the girl at eye level. "Look, I know you're doing your best to take care of him, but you can't keep living like this. Not here, not like this." The girl narrowed her eyes, as if bracing for a scolding or an offer she would have to refuse. "We don't need help. We're fine." "You're not fine," Margaret replied firmly, though her voice remained gentle. "And it's okay to need help. It's not your fault that you're in this situation." The girl looked away, as if Margaret's words had struck something deep inside her that she wasn't ready to admit. A heavy silence settled between them, broken only by the sound of rain dripping onto the plastic sheets covering the makeshift shelter. Margaret glanced around, taking in just how unsuitable this place was for anyone to live in, let alone 2 children. "I have a place," Margaret said gently. "It's small, but it's warm. And there's food. You can come with me just for tonight. Nothing more than that if you don't want to." The girl looked back at Margaret, her eyes now holding a mix of hope and fear. "You're saying you don't want anything in return?" "I don't want anything, sweetheart. Just to see you both safe," Margaret replied, offering a small smile. She stood up, glancing at the boy, who now seemed to have fallen asleep under the blanket. "At least think about it. I'll be waiting." Margaret took a few steps back, giving the girl space to process what she'd heard. She didn't want to push her. She knew trust was something that had to be earned carefully. As she turned to leave, Margaret heard a soft voice behind her. "What's your name?" She looked over her shoulder and replied, "Margaret." "What's yours?" "Emily," the girl said hesitantly, still keeping her eyes on Margaret. "He's Noah." Margaret nodded, committing the names to memory and holding them close to her heart. "I'll be at the cafe, Emily, whenever you're ready." With that, she walked away slowly, leaving the children behind with a growing sense that their meeting was no coincidence. Margaret returned to the cafe with heavy steps. Though she'd done what she could in that moment, the image of Emily and Noah in that squalid alley refused to leave her mind. Their soaked clothes, faces etched with hunger, and the weary look in the boy's eyes seemed to be imprinted on her soul. She wiped her feet at the cafe's entrance and stepped inside, shrugging off her drenched coat and hanging it behind the door. The cafe was empty, which wasn't unusual for that time of day on a rainy afternoon. Margaret used the quiet moment to prepare a hot soup. Even if Emily didn't come back, she felt the need to be ready, just in case they decided to trust her. As she chopped vegetables and stirred the pot, her thoughts kept drifting back to their encounter. Emily's defensive tone, her effort to maintain a strong posture while carrying so much weight at such a young age, stirred something in Margaret she couldn't quite explain. The bell above the door jingled, snapping Margaret out of her thoughts. She turned quickly, a flicker of hope sparking inside her, only to see an elderly couple entering, seeking shelter from the rain. After serving them coffee and slices of cake, Margaret returned to the counter and gazed out the window. The rain was still pouring, making it hard to see the other side of the street. Time passed slowly, and Margaret began to worry that perhaps she had pushed too hard. Maybe Emily would never come back. Maybe she had scared the children off with her insistence. But at the same time, she couldn't shake the image of Emily's eyes that seemed to plead for help, even if the girl herself couldn't admit it. As nightfall approached, the bell rang again. Margaret looked up and saw Emily standing in the doorway, carrying Noah in her arms. The boy appeared to be asleep, and Emily was completely drenched, her hair clinging to her face. She hesitated for a moment, as if still considering turning back, but finally stepped inside and closed the door behind her. Margaret walked over to her with a warm smile. "I'm so glad you came," she said, her voice calm but full of relief. "Come on. Let's get you both warmed up." Emily carefully placed Noah in one of the chairs near the heater and sat down beside him, still holding his hand tightly. Margaret brought over clean towels and gently began to dry the boy's face. "He needs warm food," Emily said, breaking the silence. "But I can't pay." "I told you before, Emily," Margaret replied, setting a bowl of soup in front of her. "I don't want anything in return. You both need to eat. That's all that matters right now." Emily watched Margaret for a moment, as if searching for any hidden intentions. When she found nothing but sincerity, she picked up the spoon with trembling hands and began feeding Noah. Margaret stayed quiet, simply observing. There was something almost sacred about the scene, the way Emily cared for her brother, as if the entire world depended on her protection. After some time, Noah finally opened his eyes and looked around, confused. Margaret approached him with a kind smile. "Hi, Noah. My name is Margaret. It's okay now." The boy looked at his sister, who nodded, as if giving him permission to relax. "Hi," he murmured, his voice soft and weak, but carrying an innocent sweetness. Margaret felt her eyes well up with tears. Despite all the suffering these children had endured, there was still a glimmer of hope. And in that moment, she knew she would do whatever it took to ensure that hope was never extinguished. With Noah more comfortable after eating and warming up by the heater, Margaret sat at the table with Emily. The girl still seemed wary, though there was a noticeable weariness in her expression, as if she had finally allowed herself to let her guard down, even if just a little. Margaret didn't want to push her, but she felt she needed to understand more about the children's situation. "Emily," Margaret began, choosing her words carefully, "I can see you're doing everything you can for Noah. It's clear how much you love him. But it can't be easy for the two of you to live like this." The girl lowered her eyes, fixing them on the tablecloth. For a few seconds, it seemed like she wouldn't respond. But then her voice broke through, hesitant and halting. "We don't have a choice. You don't have anyone? No adult who can help?" Margaret asked gently, careful not to sound intrusive. Emily took a deep breath, as if battling against the words she was about to say. "Mom died 2 years ago," she finally said, her voice steady, though her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "She got sick and we couldn't afford doctors. Dad," her voice faltered. She wiped away the tears that began to fall. "He left us before she died. He said he couldn't handle it." Margaret felt her heart break at those words. She wanted to hug Emily but knew she needed to respect her space. "So, since then, you've been taking care of Noah?" Emily nodded slowly. "We don't have anyone else. I tried going to a shelter, but they wanted to separate us. I can't leave Noah alone." Her voice trembled, but there was a fierce determination in her words. Margaret noticed how Emily spoke about Noah with the intensity of someone who had taken on a role far beyond her years. The girl, so small and fragile, was carrying the weight of an entire world on her shoulders. "You're very brave, Emily. What you're doing for him, it's incredible." Emily looked up at Margaret, surprised by the sincerity in her voice. For a moment, it seemed like no one had ever acknowledged her efforts before. "I just do what I can," she said, almost in a whisper. Margaret leaned in slightly, as if trying to reach Emily without crossing her protective boundary. "But you don't have to do it alone. I want to help if you'll let me." Emily was silent, processing those words. Finally, she murmured, "I don't know who to trust. People always say they'll help, but they don't stay. They always leave." Margaret felt a lump rise in her throat. "I understand why you feel that way," she said, her voice low and full of emotion. "But I promise you, Emily, I won't leave. As long as you need me, I'll be here." Silence fell between them again, but this time it didn't feel uncomfortable. It was as though a small spark of trust was beginning to form, even if Emily was still hesitant to fully embrace it. Margaret watched as Emily looked at Noah, who was now sleeping soundly, his breathing calm and steady. The girl's face softened, and for a brief moment, Margaret caught a glimpse of the child Emily might have been if the world had been kinder to her. Margaret spent a restless night sitting in her faded fabric armchair in the corner of the cafe. Despite her exhaustion, her thoughts were consumed with images of Emily and Noah. The children slept on the small couch near the heater, curled up together as if their physical closeness was the only thing keeping them safe. Margaret had placed an extra blanket over them, making sure they were comfortable, before returning to her chair. She couldn't stop thinking about what Emily had shared. The girl's courage was admirable, but the weight of the responsibilities she had to bear was heartbreaking. Margaret felt a growing urge to do more for them. Offering one night of rest and warm food wasn't enough. In the morning, Margaret began preparing the cafe to open, working quietly so as not to wake the children. As she stirred a pot of oatmeal, her eyes frequently drifted to the couch. Emily was the first to wake, stretching discreetly and immediately checking to see if Noah was still there. When she saw him still asleep, she visibly relaxed, but her eyes quickly searched for Margaret. "Good morning," Margaret said, offering a gentle smile as she set a steaming bowl of oatmeal on the table. "It's fresh. I thought you might like it." Emily hesitated before standing and sitting at the table. She looked at Margaret for a long moment before picking up the spoon and starting to eat. The distrust in her eyes had faded, though caution still lingered. After Emily finished, Margaret pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "Emily," she began, carefully choosing her words, "I know you've been through a lot, and I know it's hard to trust people. But I want you to know that you and Noah can stay here longer if you want. For as long as you need." Emily's eyes widened slightly, but she quickly looked away. "We can't stay," she said, running her fingers along the edge of the bowl. "We don't want to cause trouble." "You're not trouble," Margaret replied firmly, though her voice remained gentle. "You're children, and children need a safe place, Emily. I want this to be your safe place." Emily shook her head, but the conflict on her face was evident. "People always say that at first. But then, when they get tired, they send us away. I can't risk that. Not with Noah." Margaret felt the weight of the girl's words. "Emily, I understand why you feel that way, but I want you to know that what I'm offering doesn't come with a deadline. You don't have to decide right now, but I want you to know that you have a home here if you want it. Just think about it, okay?" Emily bit her lip, clearly struggling with the emotions rising to the surface. Before she could respond, Noah began to stir on the couch, calling for his sister in a sleepy voice. Emily quickly rushed to him, helping him sit up and adjusting the blanket around his shoulders. Margaret watched the scene silently, seeing how Emily put her brother's needs above everything else. There was a quiet strength in her actions that both broke Margaret's heart and filled her with admiration. Margaret knew she needed to be patient. The trauma these children had endured wouldn't vanish overnight, but she was determined to show them, day by day, that her offer was genuine. The morning at the cafe started quietly, with regular customers dropping in for coffee or a quick bite before heading to work. Emily and Noah sat at one of the back tables, busy with the drawing supplies Margaret had given them. While Noah seemed more relaxed, doodling simple shapes with a shy smile on his face, Emily remained vigilant, her eyes scanning the room as if ready to react to any threat. Margaret moved around the cafe, balancing her work with a sense of introspection. There was something about Emily that reminded her of herself as a child. While arranging a tray of muffins, her mind wandered back to Detroit, to the small apartment where she grew up. Like Emily, Margaret had faced challenges early in life. She had lost her parents as a teenager and had to raise her two younger siblings on her own. She understood the burden of sacrificing one's childhood to protect those you love. When a customer requested the check, Margaret reached into her pocket for change and felt the cold touch of a locket she'd worn for decades, dangling from a simple chain. It was a gift from her mother, a keepsake she had cherished since childhood. Touching it brought an unexpected wave of emotion, and Margaret decided it was time to share a piece of her own story with Emily. Perhaps it would help break through the girl's lingering distrust. After the cafe closed for lunch, Margaret sat down with Emily and Noah. "Are you starting to feel a little more comfortable here?" she asked, setting down plates of sandwiches and glasses of juice. Noah responded with a timid yes, while Emily simply nodded, her caution still evident. "Emily," Margaret began, pulling the locket out from under her blouse and holding it in her palm, "this reminds me so much of my mom. I've kept it since I was young because she gave it to me before she passed away. She always told me that as long as I had this, I'd never truly be alone." Emily's eyes shifted to the locket, a flicker of curiosity breaking through her guarded expression. Margaret continued, "When my parents died, I had to take care of my two younger siblings. It was hard, you know? There were so many times I thought I couldn't do it. But when you love someone, you do whatever it takes." The words seemed to strike a chord with Emily. Her eyes filled with tears, though she quickly turned her face away, trying to hide her emotions. Margaret reached out her hand but stopped short, respecting the girl's boundaries. "I just want you to know that I understand, Emily. What you're doing for Noah, it's incredible. Your mom would be so proud of you. Emily stayed silent, her shoulders tense, but the faintest glimmer of vulnerability crossed her face. Margaret could sense that, while Emily might not be ready to fully open up, a small crack in her defenses had begun to form. Emily looked at Margaret, her expression softening for the first time. "I just wish she were here," she said, her voice trembling. "She always knew what to do. I don't know if I'm doing it right." That evening, after closing the cafe, Margaret sat at the table with Emily and Noah for a simple yet comforting meal. Noah was more animated, chatting about the drawings he had made during the day, occasionally eliciting faint smiles from Emily. Margaret watched the children with affection, though an unsettling feeling lingered since their earlier conversation about Emily's mother. As she cleared the table after dinner, Margaret decided to ask a question she had been holding back since Emily first mentioned her mother. "Emily," she began hesitantly, but carefully, "you said your mother passed away. Did she have any close friends or anyone who used to help her?" Emily furrowed her brow, clearly surprised by the question. "No, I mean, not that I remember. She didn't trust people very much." "I see," Margaret replied, trying to hide her disappointment. But Emily seemed to be thinking about something, and before Margaret could change the subject, the girl spoke again. "There was one thing she always kept," Emily said. "A locket. She said it was very important, but she never told me why." Margaret froze. What Emily was describing sounded eerily similar to the locket she herself carried. Her mind began to race with possibilities, but she didn't want to alarm Emily or appear intrusive. "Do you still have that locket?" Margaret asked gently, her heart beginning to race. Emily nodded, but cautiously. "Yes, I kept it in my backpack. It's the only thing I have left of hers." Margaret took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "Would you mind showing it to me?" The girl hesitated for a moment, but something in Margaret's expression seemed genuine enough to ease her doubts. Emily stood, retrieved the worn backpack she had brought with her, and began searching through the few belongings she carried. When she finally pulled out the locket, Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. It was identical to hers. Margaret took out her own locket and placed them side by side on the table. The delicate engravings were exactly the same, and even the tiny scuffs on the metal seemed to tell the same story. She held Emily's locket in her trembling fingers, a wave of emotions swelling in her chest. Something extraordinary was unfolding, and Margaret could feel the weight of its significance pressing down on her, though she didn't yet fully understand what it meant. "Emily," Margaret began, her voice slightly trembling, "this locket. I gave one just like it to a very dear friend many years ago. Her name was Clara. Do you know if that was your mother's name?" Emily looked at Margaret, her expression of surprise deepening into something more profound. "Yes," she whispered. "Clara was her name." "How did you know her?" Tears started rolling down Margaret's cheeks before she could stop them. "Clara was my best friend when we were young. We grew up together in Detroit, but we lost touch when I moved to Seattle. I always wondered what happened to her." Emily seemed too stunned to speak, but there was a new light in her eyes. "You really knew her?" "I didn't just know her, Emily," Margaret replied, placing a gentle hand over the girl's. "She was like a sister to me, and that means, in some way, you and Noah are my family too." Emily stared at Margaret, her usual wariness giving way to something more vulnerable. For the first time, it seemed she saw Margaret as someone who not only wanted to help, but also had a genuine connection to her story. In that moment, 3 generations of a friendship that had spanned time were reunited, bound by a locket that carried far more than just memories. Margaret felt a lump in her throat but forced herself to give an encouraging smile. "You're doing more than just fine, sweetheart. And now you don't have to do it all alone. I'm here to help." Emily remained silent, but Margaret could tell her words were beginning to break through the girl's walls. It was a small step, but to Margaret it meant the world. The night in the cafe felt quieter than usual, as if the very space around them had paused to absorb the profound discovery they had just uncovered. Margaret still held both lockets in her hands, hers and Emily's, while her thoughts traveled back decades to the time when Clara had been a part of her life. Emily sat silently for several minutes, but Margaret could see she was processing everything that had been said. Finally, the girl asked in a low, hesitant voice, "Do you think my mom would have told you? About me and Noah?" Margaret took a deep breath, trying to organize the emotions swirling inside her. "I don't know, Emily. Clara was always very private about her feelings. Even when we were close, she preferred to handle things on her own. But I know she would have been happy to see that you and Noah have someone to help now. She was an incredible person, and it's easy to see that you've inherited that from her." Margaret's voice softened as she spoke, the weight of her words carrying both comfort and admiration. Emily's expression flickered with something that looked like hope, and for the first time Margaret felt that maybe, just maybe, they were starting to heal together. Emily looked at Margaret, her eyes shining with a mix of emotion and skepticism. "You talk about her like you knew her so well." "I did," Margaret replied softly, a bittersweet smile appearing on her face. "We were inseparable. But life took us in different directions, and I was never able to find her again." Noah, who had been distracted by one of his drawings, suddenly looked up and asked, "So, are you like our aunt?" Margaret chuckled softly, touched by the simplicity of his question. "I suppose I am," she said, gazing at Noah warmly. "And if you'll let me, I'd love to be." Emily still looked cautious, but the idea seemed to stir something within her. Margaret didn't push. Instead, she stood and walked over to a cabinet where she kept some old boxes. Returning with one, she set it on the table. "If you'd like," Margaret said, opening the lid, "I can show you some things I have from when your mother and I were young. Maybe it will help you get to know her in a different way." Emily and Noah approached slowly, their curiosity piqued. Inside the box were old photographs, yellowed letters, and small keepsakes that Margaret and Clara had exchanged as tokens of their friendship. Margaret picked up one of the photographs and held it out to Emily. "This one was taken on the day we graduated high school," Margaret explained, pointing to two young women smiling in simple dresses. Clara had the same determined look that Emily carried now. "Your mother was always so brave. She was the kind of person everyone wanted by their side when things got tough." Emily carefully took the photograph, her fingers gently tracing over Clara's face. It was as if, for the first time, she was seeing her mother not just as a distant memory, but as a young woman full of dreams and vitality. "She looks happy," Emily said, her voice trembling. "She was," Margaret confirmed. "And I like to believe that, in some way, she's still watching over you and Noah wherever she is." Emily didn't respond, but Margaret noticed the tension in her shoulders had eased. For the first time, it seemed Emily was allowing someone else to share the burden she had been carrying alone for so long. In that moment, as Margaret, Emily, and Noah flipped through memories of the past, the cafe felt less like a simple room of tables and chairs, and more like a sanctuary for lost and rediscovered connections. The next morning, Seattle's sky was still overcast, but inside the cafe, there was a new kind of warmth. Margaret woke up earlier than usual, driven by a sense of renewal. For the first time in a long while, she felt she had a greater purpose. Taking care of Emily and Noah wasn't just a responsibility. It was an opportunity to give back and perhaps make amends for what she couldn't do for Clara years ago. The children were still asleep on the small cafe sofa, covered in blankets Margaret had carefully tucked around them the night before. Emily held Noah's hand, as if even in sleep she felt the need to protect him. Margaret stood watching for a moment, marveling at the strength and love emanating from someone so young. When Emily finally woke up, she seemed slightly less guarded, though still cautious. Margaret served hot pancakes and steaming mugs of hot chocolate for breakfast. Noah, cheerful, ate with enthusiasm, while Emily remained quiet, though she accepted the food with quiet gratitude. "I was thinking," Margaret began as she cleared the plates. That maybe we could talk about what's next. Emily frowned, looking at Margaret with renewed suspicion. What do you mean by that? Margaret sat at the table, her posture relaxed to avoid coming across as authoritarian. I know you've been doing everything for Noah, and you're doing an incredible job. But maybe I can help in ways you can't do alone. Emily crossed her arms, her gaze hardening again. We don't need charity. Margaret shook her head, smiling softly. This isn't charity, Emily. It's about working together. I can help get Noah into school so he can learn and make friends. And you could go back to school too if you wanted. Here at the cafe, you'll always have a home. Emily's expression wavered between skepticism and hope. Margaret could see she was battling the desire to accept the offer. It was as if Emily had learned that trusting people meant risking being hurt. And what if you change your mind? Emily asked, her voice steady but thick with restrained emotion. What if you get tired of us, like everyone else does? The girl's words hit Margaret like a blow, but she remained calm. I won't change my mind, she said, looking directly into Emily's eyes. I lost your mother, Emily. I won't lose you and Noah too. I promise you, I'm here to stay, and I don't say that lightly. Emily lowered her eyes, biting her lip to hold back the tears threatening to fall. Noah, oblivious to the tension in the air, looked at Margaret curiously. You mean we can live here forever? Margaret smiled, her heart warming at his innocence. Yes, Noah. As long as you want, this can be your home. Noah's face lit up, but Emily remained silent, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Margaret could see that her walls were still standing, but cracks were forming. The hope that had been buried deep inside Emily was beginning to surface, even if only cautiously. In that quiet moment, with pancakes gone and plans tentatively laid out, the cafe felt more like a home than it ever had before. Margaret chuckled softly. Well, maybe not forever. One day you'll both grow up and follow your own paths. But until then, yes, I want this to be your home. Emily took a deep breath, as if trying to summon the strength to trust. I'll think about it, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. That's all I ask, Margaret replied with a warm smile. As the children returned to the sofa, Margaret felt that a small but significant step had been taken. She knew it would take time to earn Emily's full trust, but she was willing to wait. In that moment, the cafe wasn't just a place of work for Margaret. It had become a refuge, a space where a new kind of family was beginning to take shape. The following days brought a different rhythm to the cafe and to Margaret's life. Emily and Noah were slowly adjusting to the cozy environment, though Emily still kept a certain emotional distance. Margaret, in turn, spent her evenings researching and making phone calls, trying to figure out how to provide stability for the children without overstepping their boundaries. One morning, after the cafe closed, Margaret called Emily over for a conversation. Noah was distracted by some toys a regular customer had brought as a gift, and Margaret knew this was the right moment. Emily, she began, setting a cup of hot chocolate in front of the girl. I've been thinking about how we can make sure you and Noah have a better future. And I think we need to start taking some steps now. Emily looked up from her cup, suspicion flickering in her eyes. What kind of steps? Margaret smiled gently, hoping to ease the tension. Well, first, I want to help Noah get into school. He's so bright and curious, and he deserves a chance to learn. And I was also thinking that maybe you could go back to school too if you want. The girl frowned, clearly uncomfortable with the idea. And how do you think that's going to work? We don't have any documents or anything. And besides, who's going to take care of Noah while I'm at school? Margaret took a deep breath, having anticipated these questions and preparing her answers. I've already started looking into it. I've called some social services and the local school. If you let me help, we can get the necessary paperwork and make sure Noah is safe while you're studying. I'm here too, Emily. I'll take care of him whenever you need. Margaret's response seemed practical, but Emily still wasn't convinced. I don't know, she said, shaking her head. People promise a lot of things, but things never work out the way they're supposed to. Margaret could see the doubt in Emily's face, a deep hesitation forged by years of disappointment. But she also saw a glimmer of hope, faint but present, as if Emily wanted to believe even though she wasn't ready to fully commit. Margaret knew this wasn't a battle of logic. It was a matter of patience and perseverance. "I understand your fear," Margaret replied calmly. "I'm not promising it will be easy or that everything will work out perfectly right away. What I am promising is that I'll be by your side, fighting with you every step of the way. You don't have to face this alone." Emily bit her lip, deep in thought. She could sense Margaret's sincerity, but years of disappointment and hardship made it difficult to believe that things could truly change. "And what if it doesn't work?" she asked, her voice heavy with suppressed emotion. "If it doesn't work," Margaret said firmly, "we'll try something else. But the important thing is to try. You and Noah deserve more, Emily. You deserve a chance to start over." Margaret's words seemed to find their way into Emily's heart. The girl took a deep breath, her stiff posture softening slightly. "Okay," she said hesitantly, "we can try. But I'm not leaving Noah alone. Not for a single minute." "I wouldn't expect anything less from you," Margaret replied with a warm smile. In the days that followed, Margaret threw herself into the bureaucratic process of securing the children's future. It was an exhausting ordeal, filled with obstacles and difficult questions. Some of the people she spoke with seemed more interested in pointing out problems than offering solutions, but Margaret persisted. With every challenge, she thought of Emily's determined gaze and Noah's innocent smile. After weeks of effort, Margaret finally achieved a small victory. Noah would be accepted into a community school, and Emily could enroll in an alternative study program to catch up on her education. When Margaret shared the news with them, Noah let out a joyful cheer, while Emily remained quiet, softly murmuring a timid thank you. Margaret knew this was just the first of many battles, but she felt a surge of hope. Each small step forward was a reminder that the children's future didn't have to be defined by their past. With Noah enrolled in school and Emily preparing to start her study program, life at the cafe took on a new rhythm. What had once been a solitary refuge for Margaret was now filled with the sound of Noah's laughter and Emily's cautious but increasingly frequent conversations. Slowly, Emily's initial wariness gave way to moments of spontaneity, like when she helped Margaret arrange cakes in the display case or wiped down tables while Noah ran circles around her. One afternoon, during a quieter moment in the cafe, Margaret decided to teach Emily how to make her special apple pie recipe, a favorite among the regulars. The two of them stood in the small kitchen, with Noah perched on the counter, watching curiously as Margaret explained each step of the process. "First, we start with the crust," Margaret said, placing a bowl of flour on the counter. "It's all about getting the right texture. Here, give it a try." Emily hesitated, then stepped forward, rolling up her sleeves. Margaret handed her the tools, watching as the girl cautiously began to work. Margaret couldn't help but smile. For the first time, Emily seemed to let herself enjoy the moment. Meanwhile, Noah leaned closer, giggling as he tried to sneak a piece of apple from the bowl. "Hey, I saw that," Margaret teased, gently tapping his hand, eliciting more giggles from the boy. As the pie began to take shape, the kitchen filled with the sweet, comforting aroma of cinnamon and apples. Margaret felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't just the pie or the cafe, it was the feeling of connection, of building something together. For Emily, it was another small but meaningful step toward trusting that they could have a better life, one where they didn't have to carry the weight of the world alone. "First, the dough," Margaret said, handing Emily a rolling pin. "You need to work it gently. Dough is a lot like life, you know? If you press too hard, it falls apart. But if you're kind, it responds." Emily raised an eyebrow at Margaret. "Do you always speak in metaphors? Or is this just to convince me to do this?" Margaret laughed, a genuine warmth filling her heart at Emily's playful tone. "Maybe a little of both," she replied. As Emily worked on the dough, Noah asked, "Did you do this with your mom, Margaret?" The question caught Margaret off guard, but she answered with a smile. "Not exactly. My mom made amazing pies, but I was always too busy chasing after my younger siblings. I only learned how to make them after I grew up." Emily, still focused on the dough, murmured, "I don't think my mom ever made apple pie. She was good at making soups, especially when we were sick." Margaret heard the sincerity in Emily's comment and realized it was one of the rare times the girl mentioned her mother without an undercurrent of sadness. She decided to follow Emily's lead, encouraging the memory without pushing. "Her soups must have been amazing. Maybe one day you can teach me how to make one." Emily gave a faint smile, a rare but increasingly frequent sight over the past few days. "Maybe." When the pie was finally ready, the sweet and comforting aroma filled the cafe, even drawing in a few passers-by who had only intended to stop for coffee. Emily looked at her creation with quiet but evident pride. Margaret served a slice to each of them, and they all sat together to enjoy the fruits of their shared effort. "You should put this on the menu," Emily suggested between bites. "Maybe I will," Margaret replied with a wink. "But only if we call it Emily's pie." Emily shook her head, trying to hide the smile that was spreading across her face. Noah, on the other hand, clapped his hands excitedly and exclaimed, "Emily's pie! I like that." That moment, though simple, was filled with profound meaning. For Margaret, it was a reminder that the bonds they were forming were not just out of necessity, but rooted in genuine love and trust. For Emily, it was proof that she and Noah were not only being accepted but also valued. As weeks passed, Emily and Noah's presence in the cafe became a natural part of its routine. The regular customers, who often engaged in casual conversations with Margaret, began to notice the children and interact with them. Noah, with his infectious energy, asked curious questions to the visitors, while Emily, more reserved, occasionally exchanged shy smiles with the frequent patrons she was beginning to recognize. The cafe, once a quiet refuge for Margaret, now buzzed with new life, and with every passing day, the ties between them grew stronger, turning a once lonely corner of Seattle into a haven of warmth and connection. Margaret, noticing the community's growing involvement, decided to share part of the story with those she trusted. She didn't go into detail but explained that the children were going through a difficult time and that she had taken on the responsibility of helping them get back on their feet. The response was immediate and heartwarming. One morning, while Margaret was preparing coffee, one of her regular customers, Mrs. Peterson, came in carrying a large bag of children's clothes her grandchildren no longer wore. "I thought these might be useful for the little ones," she said, setting the bag beside the counter. Later that same week, Mr. Harris, who stopped by the cafe every afternoon to read his newspaper, brought in a stack of children's books and a puzzle, something to keep them busy when they're not at school. He explained with a warm smile. Other customers began contributing as well. School supplies, food, and even monetary donations that Margaret used to cover the children's basic needs. Each gesture, no matter how small, seemed to carry a special energy, as if the community surrounding the cafe was coming together to create a safe and welcoming space for Emily and Noah. One day, as Margaret was putting away the donated clothes in a new drawer she had set aside for Emily and Noah, the girl entered the room and stopped at the doorway, silently watching. "They're helping because of you," Emily said suddenly, her voice carrying something Margaret couldn't immediately place. Margaret turned, smiling. "They're helping because they see what I see, Emily. Two kids who deserve love and a chance to start over." Emily shook her head, her face reflecting a mix of gratitude and disbelief. "I'm not used to this, to people being so kind." Margaret stepped closer, kneeling so she was at eye level with Emily. "Sometimes all we need is a little push to believe things can be different. You're giving people a chance to show their kindness. That's a strength too, you know?" Emily didn't reply, but her eyes were glistening, and Margaret knew her words had reached her. That afternoon, as the cafe was about to close, Noah, who had been playing with one of the donated books, looked up and asked, "Why is everyone being so nice to us now?" Emily, sitting next to him, answered before Margaret could. "Because sometimes people just need a reason to do good." Margaret felt a swell of emotion at hearing that. Not just because Emily was opening up, but because in that moment it became clear that the children were beginning to feel something they might not have experienced in a long time. A sense of belonging. It was a quiet afternoon at the cafe when Margaret decided to organize some old boxes stored in the basement. Since Emily and Noah had arrived, she had felt an increasing need to revisit her own past, as if the memories could help her better understand the present. As she sifted through yellowed papers and faded photographs, she stumbled upon something that made her heart race. A stack of letters. The delicate handwriting on the first envelope caught her attention immediately. It was Clara's handwriting. Margaret sat down on the basement floor, holding the letter as if it were a precious artifact. The date on the envelope indicated it had been sent over 20 years ago. With trembling hands, Margaret opened the letter and began to read. "Dear Margaret, I hope this letter finds you well. It's been so long since we last spoke, but I can't stop thinking about how inseparable we used to be. Things have been difficult here. I got married a few years ago, but my life hasn't turned out quite how I imagined. I'm pregnant and, at the same time, full of uncertainties. Sometimes it feels like the whole world is against me, but I'm trying to hold on to hope. You were always the one who gave me courage. I wish you were here now to tell me that everything will be okay. I'm in Detroit, but sometimes I think about going to Seattle, just to be near someone who understands me. If you ever receive this letter, please know that I miss you. With love, Clara." Margaret could barely finish reading the letter before tears streamed down her face. What hurt the most wasn't just the weight of Clara's words, but the realization that she had never received the letter until now. There were more letters in the stack, all undelivered. Letters that could have brought them back together during pivotal moments in their lives. Holding the letters tightly, Margaret climbed back up to the cafe. Emily was helping Noah organize toys on a shelf when she noticed the expression on Margaret's face. "Are you okay?" the girl asked, her voice tinged with concern. Margaret hesitated for a moment before stepping closer. "I found something I think you should see," she said, showing the letters to Emily. The girl took the first letter and began to read. As her eyes scanned the words, her expression shifted. It was as if she were discovering a side of her mother that had never been revealed to her. "She was so alone," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. Margaret placed a comforting hand on Emily's shoulder. "She was," Margaret said softly, but even in her loneliness, she held on to hope. She wrote these letters because she wanted to reconnect. She wanted you and Noah to have something better. Emily stared at the letters, her fingers running lightly over the paper, as if trying to absorb the emotions contained in the words. "I didn't know she felt like this," Emily said, her voice breaking slightly. "You couldn't have known," Margaret replied gently. "But now we do, and we can honor her by building the life she wanted for you and Noah." Emily looked up at Margaret, her eyes glistening with tears, but also filled with determination. In that moment, Margaret saw not just the weight Emily carried, but also the strength that had been passed down from her mother. "She was," Margaret replied, placing a hand gently on Emily's shoulder. "But she never lost hope. Even in her hardest moments, she thought about you and Noah, even before you were born." Emily remained silent for a long moment before looking at Margaret. "Do you think, if she had come to Seattle, things would have been different?" "I like to believe they would have," Margaret said sincerely. "But what's important now is that you're here. And in some way, I feel like Clara brought us together again. Maybe it's her way of making sure you have the future she always wanted for you." Emily didn't respond, but Margaret saw a new light in her eyes, something that seemed to mix acceptance with hope. Clara's letters couldn't change the past, but for Margaret and the children, they brought a sense of connection that transcended time and distance. As the golden light of dusk filtered through the cafe's windows, the space felt warm and serene. Emily and Noah sat at the table closest to the counter, helping Margaret label jars of freshly baked cookies. It was a simple scene but one full of meaning. A portrait of routine, safety, and the bonds that had formed over time. Margaret watched the children with a blend of pride and tenderness. Since Emily and Noah had entered her life, everything had changed. The cafe, once a place to stave off loneliness, had become a true home, not just for them but for the small community around them. Each customer who walked through the door seemed to carry a piece of this newfound family's story. That evening, Margaret had something special planned. Once the cafe was closed, she asked Emily and Noah to sit down. Carrying a small box wrapped in colorful paper, she placed it on the table. "What's that?" Noah asked, his eyes sparkling with curiosity. "It's for both of you," Margaret said, smiling. "A gift to mark a new beginning." Emily carefully unwrapped the box, revealing 2 hardcover journals, one blue and one lilac. Both were filled with blank pages waiting to be filled. "They're story journals," Margaret explained. "You can use them to write, draw, or keep memories. I want you to know that your story doesn't have to be defined by the past. You can create a future however you want." Emily held the lilac journal, running her fingers over the pages with a thoughtful expression. Noah, meanwhile, was already scribbling in his blue journal, laughing as he created abstract shapes he insisted were friendly aliens. "Thank you," Emily said softly, her voice filled with sincerity. "No one's ever given us anything like this before." Margaret sat beside her, placing a gentle hand over hers. "You've given me something much greater, Emily. You brought life back to this place. And for that, I'm forever grateful." As the evening unfolded, the 3 of them, bound by improbable circumstances, shared stories, laughter, and dreams for the future. Emily spoke about wanting to finish her education and someday help children who had faced struggles like hers and Noah's. Noah, with his innocent imagination, declared he wanted to be an astronaut so he'd never feel cold again. Because space always looks warm, Margaret listened to every word, soaking in the sound of their voices like music. She knew the road ahead would have challenges, but she also knew that together, they were strong enough to face them. As they prepared for bed, Margaret glanced at the moon glowing outside. A deep sense of peace washed over her, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. Clara wasn't physically present, but Margaret felt her spirit in Emily's quiet strength and Noah's infectious laughter. It was as if her dear friend had ensured they found the place where they truly belonged. That night, while the children slept peacefully, Margaret opened her own journal and wrote, "Family isn't always defined by blood. Sometimes, it's made of unexpected encounters and hearts that choose to care for one another. And today, I know Clara is smiling, knowing her story lives on in the eyes of her children." If you enjoyed this story, please leave a comment to share your thoughts, subscribe to the channel, and stay tuned for more inspiring videos.